to ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Later today I have got meetings to take forward the Government's programme for Scotland.
Gray.
Yesterday, the Finance Secretary was forced to apologise to this Parliament for covering up the fact that tax-varying powers were no longer available to us. Presumably the First Minister knew that too and also hid it. Will he apologise to the Parliament too?
First Minister.
Well, I endorse what John Swinney said to the Parliament yesterday. John fully informed me of the situation. Therefore, I join in his apology to Parliament for not keeping the Parliament informed of the developments. I also support John when he pointed out, as I am sure Ian Gray must acknowledge, given he has had time to peruse the documents, that the Scottish variable rate was not in a workable condition in 2007, that it would have taken many millions of pounds to implement it, and I am sure he has also seen the quotation in the Times newspaper today saying, quote, "It was clear to the Scottish Government both before and after 2007 that there would have to be investment in the SVR to maintain the position on implementation." I assumed yesterday, when I heard Andy Kerr, that he was still under the illusion that £50,000 all was required to maintain the 10-month availability. It seems from that quotation in the Times that perhaps there is more documentation before 2007 to obtain what really was known by finance ministers before the last election.
Ian Gray.
Yesterday, of course, we called for publication of all documentation, and we have nothing to fear around that. But the document that I have been perusing as part of preparation for yesterday's events is this, the local income tax consultation launched on March 11, 2008 by the Scottish Government. That consultation makes clear that the Scottish Government planned to use the HMRC system designed to collect the Scottish variable rate in order to collect local income tax. Now they tell us that system was inoperable. Now, I always thought the local income tax was unfair, unwanted and unworkable. Now we know that the Scottish Government also knew the local income tax was unworkable, even as they launched their plans. True to form, they covered that up as well. Will the First Minister apologise for that?
First Minister.
Well, luckily I anticipated Ian Gray's question, so I brought along the consultation on local income tax. And what it actually says on page 26 is that the Government does not propose to use the SVR to replace council tax. It's on page 26, if Ian Gray likes to catch up for it. I was interested in this because one of the Liberal Democrats yesterday quoted the second part of that sentence, which says, even though the SVR could in principle be introduced relatively quickly. Yes, of course it could be in principle introduced relatively quickly, and the principle is the many millions of pounds that HMRC are asking for it to be implemented. The revenue wanted millions of pounds to put the SVR to be implemented. I think I read a range of quotations in the newspapers, and the Herald newspaper editorial today asks the question, and are puzzled by the fact that John Swinney didn't bring the matter to Parliament, given the, as it puts, the obvious political capital that could be made out of the failings of the past Labour and Liberal Democrat administration. I think this chamber should accept that John Swinney is the sort of person, when he sees a difficulty and a problem, attempts to solve it, which is what he did.
Order.
Others may have seen the advantages of showing the Labour and Liberal Democrats that finance ministers, Labour finance ministers, assistant finance ministers from the Liberal Democrats, in fact, had not kept up the SVR in a position to assure its implementation. Of course it can be implemented relatively quickly if people in this chamber are prepared to pay a multi-million-pound bill to the Inland Revenue. I don't think that's a good idea at the present moment.
Ian Gray. Order.
Of course, the second part of the paragraph on page 26, paragraph 4, which the First Minister reads, says, "The Government believes that earlier preparations made by HMRC for the Scottish variable rate at the time of devolution should provide a basis for the arrangements that will be needed to implement a local income tax." So presumably, he was suggesting at that point that they do indeed spend many millions of pounds, which they omitted to tell us about, which they knew would be needed in order to make that system operable. But you know, in a sense, this is an academic debate, isn't it? Because on the 11th of February 2009, Mr Swinney withdrew his plans to replace local council tax because he said there was no parliamentary majority. Just as well, because there was no collection system either, as it turns out. So let's talk about what he was prepared to spend. Why did the First Minister then continue to spend taxpayers' money on a staffed-up council tax abolition unit in the civil service for 18 months after this Parliament had told him to drop his local income tax? Will he apologise for that?
First Minister.
Of course, that team is dealing with a range of issues like the council tax freeze, which, if we remember, Ian Gray was against, then he was for, and then he was against it again as long as the basket of tax rises was capped. So there was a range of things that Ian Gray better decide before he gets to the election what position he's going to adopt in that, never mind pay restraint in the public sector. But can I just point out to Ian Gray, yes, it's absolutely true. If we were to implement local income tax, we'd have to have a contract with the revenue in order to put forward the implementation. A new contract would be essential to do that. But that would be paying for a contract for a tax which is fair and which would be implemented. What Ian Gray seems to be suggesting is we should have paid millions of pounds to introduce a tax that wasn't going to be implemented. And I have to say to Ian Gray, if you went outside into the streets of Edinburgh, this time not demonstrating outside the Parliament with a no pay freeze banner, but out into the streets of Edinburgh and asked the question, do you think we should pay many millions of pounds to function to the Inland Revenue for a variable rate that we're not going to implement, then even less people would support that than support the Edinburgh Tram project.
Ian Gray.
No, Presiding Officer, I'm asking why the First Minister has spent over £250,000 on a local income tax that this Parliament doesn't want and that he is not going to implement. Yesterday, we discovered the government had secretly stopped spending money on a taxpayer this Parliament should have. Today we find they were secretly spending money on a tax we don't want and they've given up on. And it isn't good enough to say that they were there working on a range of things, none of which were the thing that is the title of the unit that's there. And in fact, they've spent more money on this local income tax unit since local income tax was dropped than they'd spent before it was dropped. You know, it's bad enough. It is bad enough that this Parliament doesn't know what the Scottish Government is doing. The real problem is they don't know what they're doing either. They are an incompetent shambles. Will the First Minister apologise for that?
Order. First Minister.
A true definition of labouring a question. Listen, I believe that John Swinney was right to apologise to the Parliament yesterday for not bringing these matters for parliamentary decision. I join in that apology. But that doesn't stop the issue, the underlying issue being twofold, and it's these things. One, it's quite clear that the Scottish variable rate was not in a condition of implementation. But Andy Kerr said £50,000 right up to the debate yesterday. It's clear it was multi-million pounds to prepare its state of readiness. And secondly, the only point at which you'd be prepared to pay a multi-million pound bill is if you are actually going to invoke the power which remains for this Parliament. It doesn't make sense to invoke a power and pay the bill unless you take a decision to move forward on that basis. And if, since Ian Gray doesn't seem to like the quotations so far, on this principle, not the principle of reporting to Parliament, which I accept, but on the principle of where we should pay multi-million pound bills for something, and let me cite the Daily Record editorial this morning, which Swinney cannot. Mr Swinney may have made the right decision back in 2007, given the costs involved and his own government's plans not to use the tax during their own term in office. Can I just say to this Parliament,
very briefly,
if the
please.
Daily Record believes that John Swinney probably made the right decision, I think we can assume there's a broad swathe of Scottish society agrees with us.
Order. Question to Annabel Goldie. Order.
To ask the First Minister when he will next meet the Prime Minister.
First Minister.
No plans to meet the Prime Minister in the near future, although I wrote to the Prime Minister yesterday asking for an urgent meeting.
Annabel Goldie.
Presiding Officer, Mr Swinney was first bruised and then humbled by this Parliament yesterday, quite correctly conceding eventually that he'd got it wrong, made errors of judgment, had represented himself and his government in a very poor light, and he apologised to this Parliament. The First Minister today says he knew, and today he apologises to this Parliament, his demeanour being less than humble and his apology, frankly, being less than convincing. So can I ask the First Minister, when did he know? Did he instruct Mr Swinney to engage in this cover-up? And did his Cabinet know about all this?
First Minister.
Mr Swinney briefed me as soon as he got the document from the Permanent Secretary in May 2007. And let me repeat to Annabel Goldie, I agree with the decision that John Swinney made, which was not to pay a multi-million pound bill for a tax he wasn't going to implement. I also accept the position which John accepted yesterday, that this Parliament was due an apology for not informing the Parliament of that decision. As I pointed out, there was only, if you look at political advantage, to be gained by pointing out the decrepit state of the SVR which we inherited. But the point of principle, which is not about political advantage, is regardless of whether it was advantageous or not advantageous, then it was right and proper for the Parliament to be informed. Mr Swinney apologised yesterday for that. I've apologised today. I hope that Annabel Goldie will accept that we believe that the Parliament should have been informed about a decision about the SVR.
Annabel Goldie.
Well, Presiding Officer, I think the tiles are coming off the roof, because this wasn't John Swinney acting alone. We've just heard since May 2007 he had an accomplice who was the First Minister. And the First Minister may resort to whatever rhetoric and hyperbole he likes, but he's now just conceded that he orchestrated a cover-up, a collective irresponsibility, a concerted effort. A concerted effort to hide the truth from this Parliament and from the people of Scotland, and that is a shocking state of affairs. So will the First Minister, having admitted his culpability, eat a fare formed to him, humble pie, and will he apologise not just to this Parliament, but will he apologise? Will we apologise to Scotland for this disgraceful episode?
First Minister.
I'm Spartacus. I apologise with John Swinney to the Parliament, and I think I'm now on my fourth apology. It is a point of principle. The Parliament should have been informed. I knew about it. Mr Swinney advised me about it. I'm First Minister. I believe it's a lesson well learned. But on the issue, on whether or not it's right and proper at this time or at any time to spend many millions of pounds to the Inland Revenue on a taxpayer that you're not going to use cannot be a good decision. And the Conservative Party, of all parties, which is slashing public expenditure in Scotland willy-nilly by the day, which complains endlessly about waste in public spending, presumably Annabel Goldie is not seriously saying that we should have met a multi-million pound bill and because a tax that we weren't going to use. It cannot be credible that a Conservative or indeed any rational person would pay millions of pounds and then not use the tax.
Presiding Officer, to ask the First Minister when he will next meet the Secretary of State for Scotland.
First Minister.
Well, again, I've got no plans in the near future, but rather like the Prime Minister, I've asked for a very urgent meeting in the very near future with the Secretary of State for Scotland to discuss the Conservative Liberal Democrat version of the Calman proposals.
Presiding Officer, after all the smoke and mirrors this morning, could the First Minister, on behalf of his government, now tell Parliament exactly what Mr Swinney apologised for, given the entire...
Order.
Could the First Minister now, on behalf of his government, tell Parliament exactly what Mr Swinney apologised for, given the entire motion Parliament passed last night?
First Minister.
Mr Swinney apologised for not informing Parliament of key moments during the discussion on the Scottish variable rate and the fact that it would take many millions of pounds to make it available for early implementation. Occasionally, you are in a position of not being able to inform Parliament of some things. For example, my officials, Mr Swinney's officials, have been engaged in 14 meetings with the Treasury over the question of the Calman or a version of the Calman proposals. I know what's in the Calman proposals to be published next week. I also know what's not in them. But I'm not in a position to tell Parliament because I've been asked to keep a confidence on the detail of the proposals. Sometime you're in that position. But as John Swinney acknowledged yesterday, and I acknowledge today, on the question of the variable rate, that information should be brought to Parliament so Parliament could have made a decision as to whether John was right not to expend multi-millions of pounds on a tax power that he did not intend to use.
Presiding Officer, Parliament is asking Mr Salmond about things that he is responsible for, not other things. He has to decide how to repair the government he leads, for which he is responsible. Mr Salmond let his own independent budget review experts believe that there is no reason, in principle, why the Scottish variable rate of income tax could not be used. Mr Salmond's government implied in this chamber last week that they had considered whether to use the tax power from next April, even though they knew they couldn't. And Mr Salmond's Finance Secretary told Mr Harvey in that debate, "I do not think there is a compelling argument in favour of using the tax-varying powers at this time." Why doesn't Mr Salmond understand that Parliament passed a motion last night condemning his government for misleading Parliament? Will he now refer to his independent advisers on the Ministerial Code, the former presiding officers, that matter?
First Minister.
Well, I'll consider any letters that come into me, but can I just point out to Tavish Scott, no finance minister in this Parliament who has announced to Parliament they are not using the tax varying powers was ever in a position to implement them the following April. As we know from the documents produced yesterday, that even if the 10-month trigger period had still been in operation, that wasn't possible. You can't stand up in November and, if the 10-month trigger period had been in operation, implement it next April. I know it's a point that Tavish Scott didn't appreciate when he was calling for a cut in the variable rate, but it's always been the case. What we also know now, and what Mr Swinney and I should have brought to the Parliament, that 10-month period was not implementable. It wasn't implementable before 2007, It wasn't implementable when Andy Kerr was Finance Minister and when Tavish Scott was Assistant Finance Minister. It wasn't capable of being implemented, except if you're prepared to spend many millions of pounds to the revenue to bring the system in. If Mr Swinney had considered it important to use the variable rate at any time over the last 3.5 years, then the way to do it would have been paying to the Inland Revenue many millions of pounds. He wasn't going to use the rate, and therefore he decided it was not a good idea to waste millions of pounds of Scottish taxpayers' money.
I'll take a supplementary from Ian Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware of press reports that the Ministry of Defence is considering closing RAF Lookers in North East Fife instead of RAF Lossiemouth. Does the First Minister agree with me that it is totally unacceptable for the MOD to play one off against the other? That RAF Lookers and RAF Lossiemouth both play vital but very distinct roles in the UK's defence, to say nothing of their respective economic and social importance of the bases to the communities where they are located. And will the First Minister give me an assurance that he will support the campaign to save RAF Lookers with the same vigour and commitment he has shown to the campaign to save RAF Lossiemouth? Will the First Minister...
No, I'm sorry. First Minister, I must ask you to reply. I don't have time, Mr Smith. I'm sorry.
Can I say that I agree with the substance of the question? I agree that this looks like a pretty shabby divide and rule tactic from the MOD. And secondly, I believe that we should not allow ourselves to be divided and ruled. As Ian Smith knows, the document which was signed and endorsed by all 4 of the party leaders in Scotland did not just contain support for the North East air bases, it contained support for RAF Lookers. Now that Kinloss is destined, it seems, for closure, that is 1/3 of the air capacity in Scotland to be removed. That seems to me more than enough sacrifice for Scotland to make in this defence review. And therefore this Parliament should unite in making it clear to the MOD and to anyone else that it is not acceptable to close RAF Lossiemouth, it is not acceptable to close RAF Lookers. We should not allow ourselves to be divided and ruled.
Question 4, Sandra White.
Should be on that now. Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's working now. Thank you. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to tackle fuel poverty.
First Minister.
Well, we are providing targeted support to tackle fuel poverty through the Energy Assistance Package and the Home Insulation Scheme. The Energy Assistance Package helped over 67,000 households in its first year. It is on target to top 100,000 this year. We delivered 11,500 measures such as boilers and full central heating systems, and we are on target to do the same this year. We are also reducing the costs of heating for many other households, with insulation delivered through the Home Insulation Scheme and provided benefit and tax checks so that households can maximise their income. I know that Sandra White is aware, as I am aware, that even with these measures, which are substantial, there is still the position that substantial price increases in the cost of energy can, of course, overcome even the measures that we are taking.
Sandra White.
I thank the First Minister for his reply and welcome the help being given to people by this government, and echo what the First Minister says regarding fuel prices. I'm sure the First Minister will share my frustration that the biggest factors, as is already related to affecting fuel poverty, are energy price rises and welfare, both reserved to Westminster, and that rises in energy prices and cuts in benefits will result in more people living in poverty in Scotland. Would the First Minister also agree with me that removing monies from the most vulnerable will lead to many more being at risk of fuel poverty, and that Westminster's too fast approach to cuts will have a devastating effect on the very people we should be protecting?
First Minister.
Well, I share Sandra White's frustration that not all the levers influencing fuel poverty are at the control of the Scottish Government, and how that affects our ability as a government to meet our 2016's target of eradicating fuel poverty. Now, despite our efforts to continually improve the energy efficiency of the housing stock, there has been a 20% rise in fuel prices between July 2008 and July 2009 that far outstripped the rise in household incomes. And that is the context in which we've got to judge the cuts to welfare announced by the coalition government, and indeed the spending cuts imposed generally by the government in Westminster. The analysis and the substantial analysis from respected authorities is that on the basis of what we've seen on the welfare cuts programme so far, that those in the poorest deciles of income are going to suffer most and hardest.
Question 5, Richard Baker.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's reaction is to the recent report by PricewaterhouseCoopers that states that the number of frontline police officers will drop by 2,000.
First Minister.
Well, I suppose relief in the sense that when I examined, as I'm sure Richard Baker did, the assumptions behind the PricewaterhouseCoopers report, that they were assuming a real terms cut in police funding of 9% in the coming year. Luckily, we've managed to negotiate with COSLA, or at least all the political parties in COSLA with the exception of Labour, a totally different settlement of 2.6%. 2.6% revenue for local government and a guarantee of 2.6% for police budgets. I know that Richard Baker will join me, just as he celebrated the 1,000 additional police on the streets of Scotland, will now join me in saying, thank goodness this government was able to negotiate with COSLA a totally different situation from the Pricewaterhouse report.
Richard Baker, order.
Well, I know the Daily Record leader the First Minister referred to earlier was actually headlined SNP guilty as charged. But given the First Minister's confidence, his confidence on police numbers, despite the fact that forces are being asked to maintain numbers while having their government grant cut by £31 million and are cutting thousands of civilian staff posts, can I assume the First Minister will have no difficulty in agreeing to my request that a new independent police numbers projection study be published to allow effective planning for forces beyond the end of the next financial year? Will he agree to that request?
First Minister.
And here was me thinking that the Labour Party were against consultancies, as I'm told by Ian Gray every week. And I'll come back to that in a second, because it's very pertinent to the question. But I think we should all remember that Richard Baker has form on these issues. 2 years ago, he said that the SNP government would never achieve our target of 1,000 additional police officers on the streets of Scotland. He was even more negative than Ian Gray, who said it would take us 13 years to achieve the target. When we did achieve the target, Richard Baker, far from congratulating us on achieving the target and the lowest crime rate in Scotland for 32 years, decided to say it wouldn't last into the future. And now today, when we have an agreement with all the political parties in COSLA, except the Labour Party thus far, to help the COSLA budget to maintain police numbers at their record level, then Richard Baker cites a consultancy report which projects a 9% fall in police income instead of the deal we negotiated with COSLA. Can I just point out to him that the Pricewaterhouse paper goes on to say that they are delivering an effective service will require restructuring, and that PricewaterhouseCoopers has already done work of this sort with some large UK forces. I think PricewaterhouseCoopers were doing a report, but it seemed to me also touting for consultancy business.
Question 6, David McCletchie.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister what lessons the Scottish Government considers can be learnt from the current economic situation in Ireland.
First Minister.
Well, I think the first and overpowering one is to regulate your banks properly. But of course... But of course...
Order.
The Republic of Ireland...
Order.
The Republic of Ireland is not the only country which didn't manage to regulate its banks. Other countries like the United Kingdom didn't manage to do that, or indeed the most powerful country in the world, the United States of America. But I know, because I know David McCletchie well, and I also rather liked the tone of the Chancellor of the Exchequer's remarks in the House of Commons earlier this week, that Ireland is our strongest, closest neighbour. I'm sure everyone in this chamber will want to support the people of Ireland as they address these difficult economic and financial challenges.
David McClatchy.
I'm sure the people of Ireland are relieved they don't have a First Minister like Alex Salmond to tackle them, because, of course, at First Minister's questions only 2 years ago, the First Minister was claiming that it was the independent status of Ireland which has caused the revival of the economy of that nation. And he told us that we should all go to Dublin and learn some lessons about how to run an economy successfully. Presiding Officer, the recent events in Ireland are a graphic illustration of just how wrong Alex Salmond can be, no more so than on his party's policy of joining the euro, which has exposed so-called independence in Europe as the contradiction in terms it always was. Would the First Minister agree with me that Scotland's interests are best served by keeping the pound and by an interest rate policy which is made in Britain rather than one dictated by Brussels?
First Minister.
I don't agree with David McClatchy's analysis of the euro area, basically because if you look at the fall in output over the recession period, in the euro area as a whole, the fall in output over the recession was just over 5%. In the United Kingdom, it was 6.5%. And also, the recovery over the euro area as a whole, we're now down to 3.1% below the peak of output. In the UK, it's still 3.9%. So I think David McClatchy should look at the balance of statistics. In terms of the first part of his question, yes, I, like many other people, hugely admired the progress of Ireland coming from 30% below UK wealth per head to 20% above UK wealth per head. I thought that was a significant achievement. I wasn't the only commentator who felt that they should praise the people of Ireland for that achievement. Ireland stands as a shining example of the art of the possible in economic policy making. They have much to teach us if only we are willing to learn. George Osborne, article in the Times, February 2006.
That concludes questions to the First Minister. I suspend this sitting until 2:15.